Today we're joined by Dr. Jess Robinson, and Dr. Jess Robinson is the Vermont State Archaeologist, prior to which he taught at the University of Vermont and Johnson State University and worked in cultural resource management archaeology. He earned his PhD and MA in anthropology from the University at Albany, SUNY, his MA in literature from the University of Kent, and BAs in anthropology and in English from UVM. He's published on topics ranging from Northeast Paleo-Indians to shamans in New France in such journals as Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution, Northeast Anthropology, and Paleo-America, as well as numerous edited volumes. Today, he's joining us primarily to help sort out what was going on in the early woodland period, which is the topic of his dissertation. Thanks very much for joining us, Jess.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.
Very much. Appreciate you guys having me on, and it's good to see you both.
Yeah, it's good to see you too. We were I was just actually telling Ken that part of the reason I thought we should get you on to do this, when Matt Betts and I were working on that book, we had you look at a chapter, and you really helped me sort out the early woodland, which was very helpful. And so I guess maybe just before we get started here, though, could you tell us what the Vermont State Archaeologist does and what capacity you're joining us today?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you very much. And I am the Vermont State Archaeologist. That's my job. I'm employed by the state of Vermont. But I just wanted to mention that I'm speaking to you today as an individual Northeast scholar, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the state of Vermont in this conversation, although I'm happy to answer questions about my role or anything else you might have about that. But my opinions and assertions here are my own.
Terrific.
Thank you.
And what does the state archaeologist of Vermont do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so it's a diverse and varied set of tasks and roles. The Vermont State Archaeologist, as opposed to some other states' archaeologist, is placed within the Vermont SHPO, or State Historic Preservation Office. Each state has a version of a State Historic Preservation Office, as sort of empowered by the National Historic Preservation Act. And basically, under that federal guidance, we review Section 106 or federal projects that trigger regulatory review under the National Historic Preservation Act. That's our principal role as far as the federal government is concerned. But the Division for Historic Preservation also does a number of things outside of that, as do I. So we do state and local reviews. I do a lot of public outreach and policy review. I do things like develop white papers and testify to the legislature about things that might impact archaeology or historic preservation. I run a curation facility, so I'm basically the curator, manager, conservator, head bottle washer of the facility, and everything that comes with that, facilitating research requests and loans and ongoing conservation and consolidation efforts. Do a lot of field visits and public outreach. I'm sure you all deal with this, a steady stream of emails saying, "What is this rock?" And I found this, and a lot of other things besides. So it's hopefully some scholarship and some sort of historic context and other scholarly pursuits that help guide the practice of rigorous archaeology in Vermont.
So I'm sure the listener is also curious. Does the state archaeologist get like an allotted ration of maple syrup or maple creamies? I think that's the name of it, Gabe. Is that the
Yes.
ice cream delight? That's
Yes, there is no shortage of maple creamies, and we are not given a state allotment, although it is a regular occurrence for our division, our agency, and many in state government to avail ourselves of local creamies, and that's often, a summertime treat. Get out of work an hour early on a collaboration day and go get a creamie. Maple syrup, likewise, it's not a sign, but it regularly comes to us through various means, including a lot of fellow employees that are maple sugarers that will bring them in for Christmas gifts, things like that. So yeah,
very cool.
There's no shortage of it.
So are there any state like historic sites that are associated with like the maple industry? Just at it like
that's so interesting you say that, because there are a lot. And in fact, one of the things that sort of is part of our regulatory framework under the National Historic Preservation Act, which there's things that Canadians might not be familiar with, but sites through this regulatory environment have to be determined significant, and that means eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. And then there's various documents that we use to guide, what constitutes eligibility or significance in a particular resource type. And I have been pushing for years to do a historic context of historic maple sugaring sites. We actually know of a lot of them going back to the early 19th century, and I'd love to do sort of a comprehensive review of like how the technology's changed and what they look like archaeologically, and telltale artifact types, synthesis of site locations. So it's not an idle thing. I actually have thought quite a bit about it. It hasn't happened yet, but there are numerous archaeological sites, particularly in the Green Mountain National Forest, where archaeologists have engaged with historic maple sugaring.
It's very cool.
And I think we've just learned what Jess's second interview on the New Brunswick Archaeology podcast.
I think this needs to be like a delicious on-site interview. We'll sit by we'll go by when there's a boil down going on, we can all hang out outside and yeah.
I could, give me enough time. We could facilitate that for next spring.
All right, I'm convinced. So, but I'm sure one thing that we all have in common with Stuart Fiedel is not just that we all probably like maple syrup, although I've never met the man, but I assume he does. But we have the question of what happened in the early woodland. And so the period in the Northeast between maybe 3,000 and 2,000 years ago, and as you pointed out in your dissertation, the early woodland interaction spheres you track are among the first large-scale interaction spheres to emerge in northern Mesoamerica. So could you just tell us what these interaction spheres look like archaeologically and how they've been interpreted?
Yeah. So, I think that is a fair assessment. There were earlier manifestations of regional exchange networks, and regional being quite broad. The Shell Mound Archaic had some, regional exchange networks that went through, the Mid-South. There was a sort of southeastern exchange network. You could argue that Poverty Point is sort of, this interesting fluorescence of extra-regional trade, but apart from those nodes in the lower Mid-South, there's no evidence of other participating. They were gathering materials from disparate locations, but there's no evidence of disparate trade at the ends. But when the early woodland comes along right around 3,000 years ago, you do see the first manifestations of this interregional exchange network, and principally in non-utilitarian materials, or at least materials that were eventually produced into non-utilitarian forms. And that extends everywhere from northern Labrador with Rama chert, or central northern Quebec with Mistassini chert, to Nova Scotia copper, Great Lakes copper, shell from the Mid-Atlantic, potentially down into southern or Gulf Coast waters. Still a little bit unclear. Pipestone from Illinois and Ohio, chert from various locations from Indiana and Missouri to Ohio. Galena from potentially other sources. Slate, which might come from the Great Lakes, still very much an open question.
There's that figure that has like the grizzly bear teeth coming from the mountain regions. And
well, yeah, but that's interesting because that is Hopewell. So right. There's no grizzly bear. Hopewell gets even broader. In a certain way, Hopewell gets broader in the sense that you start getting meteoritic iron and grizzly bear teeth from the Rocky Mountains minimally, and the Hopewell interaction sphere extends all the way to the southeast and virtually the Gulf and Florida. I mean, there are some tentative early woodland sites in Florida as well. But what's interesting is, at least in this region, and we can talk about this, but Hopewell does not extend into Vermont or into Maine, or it's very, very lightly represented in Quebec. I know less about the Maritimes in Hopewell, but it doesn't seem to extend that far. It seems, the best well-documented large Hopewell sites or mounds are really in Western New York. It's about as far west as a major manifestation comes, and so it orients itself away from this far north pattern. But the early woodland, which I do not explicitly characterize as Adena or Adena related, but that's certainly one node of it, is very much involved with the far northeast. Again, all the way up the Labrador coast. So yeah,
and so what for the listener, for what distinguishes the early woodland from sort of earlier interaction is that it's not just stuff coming into the region where sort of this like kind of center. It's like ideas are emanating out, and so you're seeing the spread of all this different stuff. And so, what are sort of the so we know that goes into the far northeast, so up into New Brunswick and Nova Scotia for sure. What characterizes, you've talked about some of the material culture, but what else is characterized as this early woodland interaction sphere?
Yeah, so we see it rise. I mean, the radiocarbon dates are not voluminous. And in various manifestations, it overlaps into non-mortuary sites, most notably what's commonly referred to as meadowood. But by and large, many of these regional manifestations are largely mortuary in nature. So they arise right around 3,000 years ago, or a little bit perhaps before, in the case of some of these regional manifestations known as red ochre or glacial cane. And they extend, as far as we can understand with the available radiocarbon dates, virtually to the year 2000 or slightly before in some of these areas. So it all depends upon the area. Certain areas, most notably the Adena heartland in Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, are most noted for mound building, the emergence of dedicated burial mounds, sometimes with dedicated crypts and elaborate but repeated burial procedures and rituals throughout that Adena area. In the glacial cane area, they're defined by the conspicuous burial of individuals or groups of individuals in natural cane mounds, although that's not the case in Ontario, where there are no glacial cane features, and so there's no mounding. Red ochre in the north has burial mounds, but in the south of its range doesn't. Burial mounds occur, as you probably know, in New Brunswick and in Nova Scotia, but not in Quebec and not in Vermont and not in Maine. But they are defined in terms of its mortuary component by very circumscribed cemeteries, not disparate, sometimes quite large. At, for instance, the Boucher Cemetery, it was quite a small area and yet had approximately 90 burial or cenotaph features with almost no overlap in them, indicating that they must have been marked in some way, and that this cemetery was used for probably about 600 years, perhaps even more, and so repeatedly visited, repeatedly used, and yet marked and added to in a purposeful way. And at least in Boucher, I was able to trace that there's a fair amount of structure to that cemetery. So repeatedly used over time. I argue for a dedicated group of individuals, not just the general populace. But so the range of materials in aggregate is flowing through this broad interaction sphere, and yet the regional manifestations of mortuary complex, and in some cases non-mortuary, are quite different. And if you look, with enough specificity, you can see a lot of different regional and even individual differences. And I think that's very interesting.
Yeah.
And so I think that regionalism is actually one of the things that is most confusing, at least for me, about the early woodland. And so I recall, I think in AENA or something years ago, Mike Heckenberger said something about that there are basically all of these terms that describe this seemingly temporally and spatially overlapping phenomena in the early woodland. And so we talk about like the Boucher complex or Adena or Middlesex or all this stuff. Could you just untangle some of that terminology, or even just contextualize how we should talk about the early woodland?
And for the listener, when you're listening to this part of the episode, you can pull up Jess's dissertation on page 157. There's a map that could be very helpful for you to kind of contextualize this geographically.
Yeah, and I should note the reason why I even engaged in this dissertation, when you bring up Heckenberger and another one of the co-authors, Jim Peterson, is he was Jim Peterson was my mentor, and the Boucher remains, I should say, had long been reburied before I even became an archaeologist. They're respectfully interred and back at the site where they were originally excavated. But there was a long process of analysis of the artifacts and burial features prior to reburial. And all that material was sitting, in shelves and, it completely analog. None of it had ever been digitized. And when Jim passed away, it was one of the things that made me think, well, this has already been subject to analysis. This data is there. It was Jim's great unfinished project. And so I sort of took it upon myself, but I never engaged with any of these materials directly. This was purely an archival analysis. So that's a caveat. And so that was one of the starts of thinking about my dissertation, even as I entered graduate school. But I, like you brought up, was originally confounded by all these terms and the broad sweep of the interaction sphere and all of these sort of old tropes that were kicking around the literature, like the Adena interaction sphere was the most notably, and the Adena was the heartland from which things sort of diffused to these outer peripheries. And when I started looking in detail, it just didn't make a lot of sense. And Heckenberger, Peterson, and colleagues noted that. And really, the Adena phenomenon, as remarkable as it sort of was late in the sequence, as far as we can tell from the radiocarbon dates. The other ones, Meadowood, Glacial Kame, Red Ochre, emerged roughly 500 or more years prior, in disparate parts of the eastern woodlands. And so part of it was tracking the geographic and then chronological parameters of it. And chronologically, Red Ochre, Glacial Kame, Meadowood, Middlesex have almost no differentiation. It's possible, and it's perhaps likely, that Red Ochre and Glacial Kame emerged slightly earlier, that they were slightly earlier manifestations, and Meadowood and Middlesex, which are essentially the same thing. They're really, it's no differentiation.
And the idea is that Middlesex is the mortuary component and Meadowood is the habitation sites.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you really parsed out, there might be an earlier sort of manifestation, but it blends very quickly into the same thing. It's really not a valid taxa as far as I'm concerned. But spatially, there is a lot of spatial integrity in what has been called Red Ochre, and then what has been called Glacial Kame, and what has been called Adena. And then Meadowood Middlesex is all just this northeastern manifestation, which doesn't have a lot of geographic integrity yet. I mean, geographic specificity. They blend into one another. And all of these things are very interesting because they emerge, archaeologically very rapidly and to synchronously, at least as far as we can tell with the currently available dates, but they have different sort of notable, distinctive, characteristic artifact forms with them. So glacial came, which is the inland freshwater glacial lake centered mortuary phenomena, is defined by the presence of marine shell. Most notably, that's sort of some of the most indexical artifacts of this mortuary complex are marine shell gorgets, what are called sandal shell gorgets. Red ochre is defined by these turkey tail, hypertrophic blades, which are almost uniformly made from Wyandotte chert from Indiana. And these Morse knives, which are actually made from Crescent Hill chert in Missouri. Meadowwoods are defined most notably by meadowwood cache blades, which are, not exclusively, but largely made from Western Onondaga chert around the Eastern Great Lakes into sort of central New York region. But then there's a lot of differences and interesting overlap that hint at connections between them. For instance, Ontario glacial came sites have meadowwood blades in them and, bird stones. The Boucher site has a circular shell gorget. And so there's very interesting things while largely maintaining some distinctiveness, even at the individual site or cemetery level.
Great. And so that's very helpful. And so in the Northeast, then you kind of hinted at this. We've got some hints of interaction, I guess, across this vast area, but we have some fairly specific manifestations of early woodland.
Yes. So, this is, sort of what's interesting is, so Vermont has, 4 known early woodland cemeteries that have been called Middlesex, previously. The Swanton site, the Boucher site, and which are only about 20 kilometers away from each other in northern Vermont in the Swanton Highgate area. And then in the other near to Lake Champlain, the northern end of Lake Champlain, and then in the southern Lake Champlain area, there's the East Creek site and the Bennett site, which I didn't look at, which was completely looted in the 1940s, but Ritchie did take photographs of that, and you can see those in pre-Iroquoian occupations in New York State. Okay. And I should say that with the East Creek site, I did work with the permission of the Stockbridge Munsee Mohican, and they agreed to all my research, which again was not obviously excavation, but was engaging with the curated artifacts and extant archives. So just wanted to note that. But yeah, I mean, what I noticed in the analysis of those was that they're separated by less than 100 miles on either ends of Lake Champlain. Lake Champlain would have facilitated easy travel up and down the lake. Certainly not a huge distance between them, and yet they evinced very different artifact inclusions, through time, persistently, and affinities with seemingly different nodes of this broad interaction sphere. So, for instance, at the Boucher site, there was a significant amount of northern lithic materials, Rama chert, Mistassini chert, perhaps argillite from Quebec. None of that was at East Creek. At East Creek, there was an affinity with turkey tail blades, including one from Indiana that was made of Wyandotte chert, others that were made of more regional materials, but nevertheless, copied the form. There wasn't a single shell artifact at East Creek, and yet they were fairly common at Boucher and terms of beads and other items of adornment. Meadowwoods were very common at East Creek. There wasn't a single one at Boucher. And, so what it suggests is there was a select number of exchange partnerships that I argue were established and then cultivated through time. Yeah. These people, either by choice or by ability, didn't have access to the full range of materials circulating throughout the interaction sphere. Rather, I argue they cultivated relationships with one or more partners, and then through time, those materials likely took on specific connotations important to those groups.
Yeah, so these are overlapping in time, but it looks like they're kind of operating in exclusionary trade relationships despite kind of participating in this bigger idea, eh?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
And so,
yeah.
So what is the relationship between the mortuary and the non-mortuary sites? I was talking to Gabe about this when we were going to get you on the show. I remember you did a paper at ESAF years ago where you were looking at like viewscapes or something like that between Boucher and I think it was one of the habitation sites. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes, and so this is really interesting because in Swanton, where the Boucher site is located, it is currently sort of a peninsula, defined on one side by the Missisquoi River and on the other side by an oxbow. But doing some geomorphological analysis and extrapolation, it seems pretty clear that at the time Boucher was actively being used as a cemetery, it was an island in the Missisquoi River. But notably, this sort of island or peninsula-like landform continued to be used up through and beyond the contact period as a cemetery space for the Abenaki. We have evidence of late woodland contact period cemetery on another part of the peninsula. So it is powerful testimony to the fact that this was a sort of sacred landform, through time, all the way to the contact period. And eventually we do find, habitation evidence on this landform where we've, seen it in like eroding banks or in, very targeted excavations for things like, small construction things that we monitor on this road. But during the early woodland period, it appears that it was not occupied at all for habitation. All the habitation sites that we know about were on the other side of the Missisquoi, and we do see small early woodland habitations, and that characterizes all the early woodland sites in Vermont. They're very small. We don't know of any major habitation sites, maybe near the East Creek area in Orwell, as indicated by some artifact collections, but no professionally excavated large early woodland sites. And yet the mortuary component was very long-lived, very, very elaborate, and very broad. But there virtually no overlap. Nearby, but no overlap.
Interesting.
That's really interesting. And so what our theme supposedly this season of the podcast, Jess, is social complexity. And actually what you just outlined is maybe a tension here in trying to think about social complexity in the early woodland. But one of the things that you've also worked on is that these massive ritual spheres have a whole bunch of evidence for social differentiation when we think about so-called simple societies. And you pointed out that or argued that it might have been maintained by aggrandizers with esoteric knowledge, who were also aided potentially by seeming to be able to respond to climatic conditions. Could you tell us more about this? I really like this idea, and I think it's super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so when I was, you when you really look at this mortuary evidence, you see a lot of. I should say framing the overall early woodland period. you see, I did a chapter where I tried to the very best of my ability, and I am not an environmental scientist, and so it took a lot of effort and extrapolation and asking colleagues, but I think I made a pretty convincing case, guided by a number of other more expert scholarly treatments in the environmental sciences, and Fiedel's work and other archaeologists, that there is an environmental downturn that likely begins earlier, in the Susquehanna horizon, but becomes much more evident by 3,000 years ago. When I say downturn, I mean things became colder and wetter. And there's various proxies: lake levels, particular tree species abundance, paleostorminess, that seem to indicate this. And I think that may have been there might be myriad other factors that the archaeological record doesn't reveal, but I think that might have been a catalyst for social change. Certainly, in Vermont, site sizes and the numbers of sites decline from previous periods, as far as we can tell archaeologically, and that might be a proxy for, a tentative proxy for population sizes. And so you looking at this data, in a straightforward way, as a grad student, you might think, oh, these are precisely the wrong conditions for, emerging social inequality, social aggrandizement. But, there's a whole corpus of literature about crisis conditions and the emergence of particular forms of leadership and aggrandizement. And what I began to see is that, you can't, if everything is more tenuous, these aren't the conditions to manipulate, resources of abundance, that, you can, for instance, manipulate all of the maize surplus to elevate yourself beyond your peers. But it might be precisely the conditions whereby, if you control esoteric knowledge, in reductively termed as shamanism, control of the supernatural, or intercede on behalf of the populace towards the supernatural, manipulate things towards better ends, then you might be able to accrue power beyond those privileges usually accorded you.
And this is how I run my intro class, actually.
Yeah, I mentioned it in my dissertation, but I actually I published a paper in 2021 where I actually in Northeast Anthropology, where I actually looked at this in terms of contact period shamanism, and basically, there's obviously profound crisis conditions for many, if not most, native groups at the onset of colonialism and sustained, contact, the imposition of market economies, the imposition of religion, disease, and obviously the records there are biased. But looking principally at the Jesuit relations and in New France, what you see is the shamans were first the Jesuits' main sort of they were perceived as the most powerful impediment to the conversion. They were the ones that were feared. They spent most of their energy trying to belittle them, to undermine them, and the shamans themselves seemed to have accrued inordinate amounts of prestige, and that manifested where we can see in the chronicles in a lot of payment for services rendered, they were exempted from hunting and other mundane tasks. They were given lots of gifts, and using that as an analog, you can see that potentially similar things may have occurred 3,000 years ago. That when you're in a situation of crisis, you turn some portion of the populace will turn towards the magical religious practitioners to try to receive relief from their maladies, and that might have a material component to them, either materials that are accrued as gifts, but also things that are used in these ceremonies and that connote prestige by having them, wearing them, utilizing them.
So these could be your exotic items, your big elaborate burials, your blocked end tubular pipes from who knows where, all these kinds of things.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the accumulation of that stuff must have been really rapid, because these ideas move very rapidly, right? Like this is all happening kind of, so to, this view from the far northeast for us is, for example, Augustine Mound is a very famous site.
Yeah.
And the dates of the earliest components at Augustine Mound are among the, around 2800-ish, which means that very early on, these ideas and these aggrandizers, or these, very powerful individuals, have created networks that extend right to sort of the end of the world, I guess, on the East Coast. And so, do you have an idea of how those processes work? Are these, how it must have been rapid, right? And facilitate, they must have emissaries or people that are going out to share this idea, or is it that they've accumulated that social capital so quickly that they themselves are traveling to kind of share or proselytize, kind of like.
It is.
The listener can't see this, but Ken is getting more excited, and Jess is telling him to stop. Stop before it's
no. I was just going to say it's the biggest question, and it's been thought about not so much in the early woodland context, but people have thought about this in the Hopewell context, and it's equally, there's equally different possibilities. Like you said, Ken, it could be that part of the whole process was actually like these pilgrimages of adventure to go out and acquire these exotic things and bring them back directly. It could be that these people of prestige cultivated specific trade relationships, and that these were held on very, very tightly. One of the things I read was that I took a lot of interest in was that the Huron developed trading partners, and that they would hold on to these trading relationships with different European entities, and what they valued was the relationship, and so they weren't interested in sort of the market economics of it. They would want the same price every year, for the same amount of thing, because it was a cultivation of the relationship. It wasn't the end line recipient. It was, sometimes it was just that relationship itself. And I thought about that as sort of an analog, that might pertain. But there's a number of other, was it down the line and it's just when people passing, they would grab it? I don't think so. I think that these relationships, even far flung, were maintained and I don't want to say nurtured, but this wasn't casual. Or it might be that they went and got them themselves. It's entirely unclear. And likewise, is it unclear like what is being traded out of Vermont? Don't really know. Jim Bradley, scholar who's worked a lot on the Onondaga, but with everywhere from the Paleo-Indian period to the early woodland period, a number of years suggested to me that in the slate belt of Vermont and adjacent eastern New York is really the only area where you can get reliable, abundant red slate, which is a prominent material in the early woodland interaction sphere. Maybe that is a commodity that was being traded out. Karine Taché has maybe talked about fish oil as being a commodity that was traded. And people bring up furs. Not really sure. It's a little bit of a mystery, partly because it's those materials, with the potential exception of red slate, weren't durable. So yeah, that's a great question, Ken. I do not know the mechanisms. I can speculate, but it's not clear at this time.
And I'm interested in the late woodland, and it's so different from the late woodland where you have examples of these big, like kind of aggregations or like bigger sites and stuff like that. And my understanding is that you don't really see that in the early woodland. So it's not like people are coming together in one spot to exchange all this stuff, like how we envision other periods.
No, I mean, there are large early woodland sites. I think of Batiscan and Pointe de Boisson, but even there, no evidence of sort of coming together this sort of trade fair model that has been hypothesized in other contexts. You just don't really see it. The possible exception is the Delmarva Peninsula, where the sites down there are extremely complex and filled with a lot of exotic material from all over the early woodland interaction sphere. And Darren Lowry, who's done work on that, it suggests that part of the sort of abundance might be because they were sort of the brokers of shell,
Right.
whelks, olivella, shark's teeth, that they're all very abundant on the Delmarva Peninsula. So that might be a way to look into at least one node of that, but still, you need to look at a lot of different things to get at it, and it's hard to. It's I haven't parsed that yet. So
the Delmarva Peninsula never makes anything in North American archaeology easier, does it?
No, that really
is. But so, Jess, while we're all in a speculative mood, I wondered if I could ask you to sort of bookend the early woodland a little bit, and do these relationships lead to either what causes the early woodland cultural phenomenon to happen, coming out of the transitional or terminal archaic, and then what do you think causes this phenomenon to end?
Yeah, it's a great question. I am not entirely sure what causes it to end, but what's notable is again getting back to how we sort of started in talking about the Hopewell. In other parts of the continent, Hopewell just comes right out of Adena and gets more elaborate and more complex and very conspicuous. That's when you see, like the ton of Wyandotte chert discs being interred in burial mounds, and and then there's the ritual processionals and various astrological alignments emerge, and the mounds get very complex. But in Vermont and in adjacent areas, burial elaboration, non-local exchange, even the manufacture, as far as we can tell, archaeology of non-utilitarian durable goods just drops off. There's no burial elaboration at all that we see in Vermont, and yet the number of sites increases. Early middle woodland pottery, defined most notably by pseudoscallop shell decoration, is very abundant throughout Vermont. And so my assertion in my dissertation, which I haven't seen anything since then to really refute this, is that things got better or people were able to reorient their, lifeways to accommodate, newfound environmental, potentially political and social regimes. And they said, okay, we don't need to invest all of this surplus energy into our, magical religious practitioners anymore. And that falls off completely for a few hundred years. Interestingly, some amount of non-local exchange emerges again in what's called we call the Jacques Reef horizon, but it's much more limited. And really, there's three materials that we see in the Jacques Reef horizon here in Vermont with some regularity: non-local materials, Onondaga chert, Pennsylvania jasper, and Rama chert still comes in. Yeah. And so nothing really further west than that, much more oriented, sort of along the Atlantic seaboard inward to, central New York is about as far as it goes. But it's an interesting, sort of, up, down, up trajectory for non-local exchange in any case.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, like that pattern in Vermont is basically the same as what we see in the Maritimes, right? Like it's, the middle woodland. And so with Vermont too, do you see the same kind of like, there's speculation that there's like a population boom basically in the middle woodland in the Maritimes. And I'm guessing is that kind of the same thing that you guys see in Vermont?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. And again, when I teach a class, I always tell my students that there's no more thankless job in archaeology than demography, because it's so difficult. But yes, using the proxies of site numbers, site sizes, ubiquity of artifact classes, things like that. Yes, it seems impressionistically very likely that there was a population increase around 2,000 years ago.
Measuring by
again,
per square mile.
Excuse me?
That's the chert per square mile approach.
It's more like pseudo scallop shell pottery decoration per square mile. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And again, referring to that sort of ethnohistoric paper I wrote, under normal circumstances, indigenous groups, were fairly, circumspect of their shamans or magical religious practitioners. They were seen as powerful, but they were also, sort of viewed with suspicion, and there were sort of power negation strategies that were normally in play to sort of neutralize the aggrandizement of a potential shaman. And what I argue is in situations of crisis or perceived crisis, those power negation strategies might be suppressed or go out the window. But when things get back to normal, they can come back into play, which I think is one reason I argue that these power asymmetries didn't stay asymmetrical and grow into, more established, codified, positions of prestige through time. So, yeah.
Putting you on the spot here, but could you give us an example just of one of those power neutralization strategies? That's really interesting.
Yeah, well, Lafay too, talks about numerous instances with the Mohawk, where they were, if and this breaks down into if it's, we have to interpret what he was saying because they use all these derisive terms like juggler and medicine man, and but basically what he was saying is there's two types of magical religious practitioners. There are the healers, which do good, and then there's what he calls the magicians, or you might call conflict shamans, or other things that they've been called in, say, Amazonian contexts, that are thought to wield spells towards perceived enemies or anyone else. And Lafay too says that they on numerous occasions tried to kill those perceived evil shamans, and that the shamans would have to do massive displays of propitiation, giving up wampum and other things to try to quell the suspicion that they were acting against the best wishes of individuals within the community or the community at large. And it was very, very common to think that shamans in enemy communities, rival communities, were engaging in malevolent actions against them, casting spells, and then there were things that the populace would do to try to negate those spells, and their own shamans would be engaged in sort of ritualized warfare against those enemy shamans and things like that. So there was a lot of that going on, but it I think in normal times it engendered a climate of circumspection against this. You needed them, but you didn't. They
were need them all the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Very cool. So what was that?
Go ahead, Ken. Sorry.
Well, so Gabe caught this and I didn't. And before we're going to jump off of Early Woodland for a moment here, and You have an academic background in literature. So how did that come about, and how do you think the emphasis on narrative and story, like I think the listener can probably pick up on this in the way that you're able to talk about what's going on in the early woodland. How's that
And
change
he
your
uses
perspective?
phrases like massive displays of propitiation, which is and that's an MA in literature right there.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it sort of stumbled into it backwards or accidentally, in the sense that I went to a small private school, Catholic, and I felt sort of constricted or restricted there. But the one outlet I had, there wasn't things like anthropology or anything else. It was a very rigid program. But the one thing I really gravitated towards was literature, and that was by far my best subject in high school, and where I became an avid reader and loved literature for its ability to reveal things in eloquent, novel, and inspired ways about the human condition and humanity. And so I went into the University of Vermont wanting to be an English major, and that was my declared major. And then, my freshman year was the last year that actually you had to go in and just leaf through in these giant rooms. You had to leaf through these big, paper catalog books of all the course offerings that you could take as a freshman before it all went online the following year. But I was leafing through and, started with A and saw anthropology, and it was Introduction to Archaeology. And I, had always been interested in archaeology passively, reading National Geographic. And I thought, oh, this is really cool. And I felt this immense sense of freedom, like, oh, I can take this class. This is amazing. And so I took Introduction to Archaeology, and it was revelatory. And then the following year, I took or the following semester, I took another class. And then the following year, I took a class by, who became the person who became my very good friend and mentor, Jim Peterson. And that really sort of cemented it. And so I said, well, this is what I want to do. But I realized I could just do a double major. I didn't have to give up literature. And so went through being a double major, and there's a thing, I got a scholarship my senior year to go over and study in England and on a literature scholarship, and then came back and immediately started doing CRM archaeology. But like most new CRM people, I got laid off when the snow began to fall and the ground froze, and ended up working, in a bakery, waking up at 3:30 in the morning to bake bread. And I was sort of, as a new graduate with this newly minted undergraduate degree.
And this is where your mother said, what did you think you were going to do with a double major in anthropology and English?
Exactly. And so I got an offer to go back to that place where I, spent my senior year on scholarship, the University of Kent, to do a master's degree. And I took it. And so I got there, and about 2 weeks into my graduate courses, I realized I did not want to pursue this as a career. That by that time I realized, as much as I love literature and how much it revealed things about the human condition, it was sort of a looking through a mirror. And I realized anthropology was and archaeology is a much more direct way to get at what humans were doing in the past. And so I carried out my degree, had a great time in England, and then came back and did archaeology ever since. So that's how I.
That's a fantastic story. That's
yeah. What was your thesis on in English?
Excuse me.
What was your English thesis on?
It was on the symbolic use of violence in works by William Faulkner and Cormac McCarthy. Was my master's dissertation.
Oh wow. Okay. Cool.
It's been a long time ago. I wouldn't be able to say much more beyond that. I stumbled across a hard copy of my master's thesis a little while ago. I couldn't even read it. I picked it up and I was like,
Well,
yeah.
We'll try to call the episode Blood Meridian or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thanks very much for joining us about this, Jess. This was a really interesting conversation, and it was nice to chat with you about your thesis, because we corresponded a bit about it explaining some things for me, which I really appreciate. So it was good to have this conversation.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on. This is great, and unpacking the early woodland, I think, is always helpful.
Yeah, happy to do it. Good to see you guys.
Thanks again.
All right.
Featuring Gabe Reinick and Ken Holyoke. The New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast.